1 week season.
What is going on, 1 week season fam? Welcome to another installment in the Industry Experts series through the Best Ball Plus product at 1 week season. I have the distinct pleasure to be joined by a man that I had the privilege of chatting with every week last season, I should say. And that is the great Rich Hribar. So without further ado, if you're not familiar with Rich, I need you to crawl out of the rock you've been hiding under for the last 15 years, because this man is one of the true OGs in the fantasy football game. Rich, pleasure to be speaking to you again today. How are we today, my man?
I'm doing good, man. Listen, I missed you. We haven't done a show since,
Right?
week 18 last year. So, it's our first time kind of catching up this off season. Hopefully we're going to run it back this year. But man, it is that time of year. Like camps are.
Yes.
I saw some Texans footage yesterday. Like the
Yes.
guys. It's like, man, it is here.
Yes. And we're going to talk about a lot of important stuff, what we're excited about, what we're looking for in some of these offenses as far as camp. I know that you just got done breaking down every team from a top-down level, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we jump in here, man, I kind of want to hear what you're looking for, what you're excited to see out of camp. Is there any situations or spots where you're looking for news where it could really, really have a big grasp on what we are doing in fantasy football this season?
Well, I mean, listen, I didn't do a lot of news when I was at Roto World at NBC, but I can tell you, just from the background, this time of year, things get like crazy, Wild West out here.
Busy
with,
season,
the,
yep.
the tweets and stuff. But I will say, so you want to be able to kind of pick your news kind of correctly during this period. Is you want to actually follow actual reporting and not stuff that's like prediction based around this time of year. You'll see some stuff from beats that'll be like, I think Pat Fryermuth could catch 100 passes this year. But you have to take all that stuff with a grain of salt, because a lot of those people that are beat reporters, they don't do top down projections. They don't take into account there's only how many plays a team's going to run, what the splits are going to be. That's more just spouting stuff off a guy looks good, right?
Yeah.
But you can actually, what you want to find is the things that are like I said, the actual reporting, take Denver Broncos, for example. When the Broncos camp opens up, we want to know, all right, what's the order of these running backs, right? Who's getting used in what situations in camp? Those are things you want to follow. So you want to follow things that are actual reporting, because not everything that does come out is news. And listen, I worked a couple of shifts where you got to kind of turn some stuff into news or some headlines, but you want to make sure that you're looking for actual reporting first.
That is a great tidbit to throw out. I call it the bullshit goggles. They got to come on this time of season. We need to be able to weed through what is pertinent, what is important, what can we glean. Are there any specific situations, backfield, depth charts, wide receivers, injuries, anything like that you're really keeping an eye on over the next week or so?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, the Broncos are the one that came to my mind. What kind of designation are we get for some of these running backs? What kind of roles are they going to be in? How is Audric Estime actually in a competition with Javonte Williams, right, for early down stuff? This is a guy that goes in the bottom 3 rounds in current best ball drafts now. Could he be a dark horse, right? The Bills wide receiver situation, right? We want to know, not only kind of what the pecking order is in terms of reps, but where are these guys playing, right? Khalil Shakir is a guy who's basically been just a slot so far in the NFL. That's where Curtis Samuel has played, but Curtis Samuel does have a year under Joe Brady where he did play outside. Is Curtis Samuel going to be more of a flanker this year? Is he going to be playing more outside? So we kind of want to find those types of situations, kind of some clarity on kind of the muddy depth chart stuff. Are we going to see in long down and distance situations, is Antonio Gibson going to play in those situations versus Ramondre Stevenson, right? Ramondre Stevenson is a guy who got a big contract this offseason, but has historically been a guy that's gotten over for fantasy football because he has had kind of that pathway in and being kind of a profile that he didn't really fit, right? He has a lot of catches in the NFL. I call it the Leonard Fournette syndrome, right? Leonard Fournette is a guy who caught a lot of passes, but really didn't do anything with them.
Yeah.
And that's how Rick Ramondre Stevenson's been as a pass catcher so far in the NFL. So if he's not going to play in like long down and distance or like catch up mode, like that's going to be significant this year on a team that is projected for 4.5 wins and a win total. Like, so if Antonio Gibson's cutting into that, does that give Antonio Gibson some life as like some standalone value in some of these situations? Does it ding a guy like Ramondre Stevenson? So that's what I'm saying. You're looking for just kind of some clarity and actual reporting on where some of these like players are going to be utilized.
There's two other backfields that really come to mind, where there's so much uncertainty, and they're we're expecting these backfields to be fairly fantasy relevant, and that's the Bengals and the Cowboys. Do you have an early read, or are you kind of just leveraging some uncertainty in early drafts right now? And what are you looking for to, I guess, over the next week, 2 weeks in early camp out of those two situations?
I mean, I've always kind of thought that since the Bengals signed Zach Moss, just given the status where they are as a franchise, that they were going to like lean on Zach Moss more than they would Chase Brown. And, obviously Chase Brown can play himself into more opportunities, but this is a guy that you go back to his final year in college. Like he's been a very boom or bust runner, and he was that as a rookie. I mean, he was out of all running backs with 25 or more carries last year, because he didn't get that many carries. So we've got to lower the arbitrary threshold. He had the worst success rate, right? Like we remember the big plays, but like on a veteran team that's trying to win a Super Bowl, like they're going to value those like ham and egg runs that like Zach Moss is going to get you, right? So I do think that is going to give him an edge in. I've been kind of open to the idea that like we still aren't going to see the complete Cowboys backfield. I still feel like there's an opportunity, like someone else can get involved in this situation, whether it be a camp cut or another guy that gets signed along the way. But I mean, it's hard for them not to say, like, you look at Ezekiel Elliott's like career, like to say like he's still going to be a guy that they trust in like those short yardage situations and on passing downs, even though last year was one of his worst seasons in pass protection. But I mean, they're not going to put like Rico Dowdle in pass protection on, you know, I mean, it's just not one of these things that's going to happen. It could be a situation too, like, I mean, Royce Freeman could be live still. Like, I mean, it sounds funny to say, but like, this is a guy that keeps like hanging on to rosters because he's, kind of just a reliable player too. But I've always been under the assumption that like the Cowboys are still one of these teams, like whether it be a Miles Sanders or someone else, like could they be, not done yet?
Yeah. And do you think that's more of an indictment of Rico Dowdle or Zeke as far as expectations go?
I just think it's just all encompassing, right? Just kind of the box they've kind of put themselves into this offseason. And I mean, we still don't have the CeeDee Lamb contract. Like we're still waiting on it. We know it's going to happen, right? Like there's just no way it's not going to happen eventually. But like, so, I mean, the Cowboys just, and you just look at what it's done to their roster, the box that they put themselves in as an organization between what they've done with like the Dak contract situation and obviously the Lamb, like it's just, they're the most top heavy roster, I think, in the NFL. Like the gap between where they have at the top of their roster versus the depth on this roster. I mean, it is paper thin. And this is a team that's like screaming regression too. I mean, they scored points on 54% of their drives last year. Only 6 other teams, since in my database going back to 1992, has scored at a higher rate of their drives. Dak Prescott threw the most passing touchdowns over expectation last year in the NFL. I mean, this is a team it feels very fragile to me, like what the Cowboys have built. Like if they're one CeeDee Lamb injury, and God, we don't want this to happen, but man,
don't even say it on air, dude.
But Jesus, dude, if CeeDee Lamb were to miss any time, like this is just not a good. It's not a good team. It's made me scared a little bit about Dak. Like Dak's a guy that's kind of fallen a little bit for me throughout the process, not just the regression stuff, but it's like it's a hyper fragile roster right now.
So with that said, how are you handling Brandon Cooks and Josh Ferguson or Jake
Ferguson?
Jake Ferguson, yeah.
So Jake Ferguson, I know, is a guy that's gotten kind of dunked on throughout the offseason, right? Like because a lot of people treat him as like a guy that maybe isn't a special talent. But I mean, he already in year 2 was second on the Cowboys in targets. They don't really make any changes. They add really Ryan Flournoy is like the only offensive change, like a guy that's going to compete with, the Jalen's, at wide receiver 3 this offseason. So we want tight ends that this is what you look for a tight end. You look for a guy who's an ascending career arc, right? Jake Ferguson is that. He's going to be a year 3 player. You want a guy that you can make an argument for he's going to be a top 2 target in his offense. He already was in year 2 on a team that didn't really add anything. So it's hard for me to really tear him down. And he did have a huge red zone presence as well, being 4th in the NFL, in red zone target share among tight ends. So I think that, he's kind of been left as like a properly priced player, right? To me, I don't think Brandon Cooks is going to make a jump, right? Like I want to make the argument for him, but this is a guy who clearly it's like trying to catch the falling knife, right? Like he's going to be 31. He's had 2 back-to-back years now where he's been below 800 yards. It's like these guys don't typically bounce back in the NFL. So and like I already said, like Brandon Cooks is a guy who lived on touchdowns. He had the 8 touchdowns that kind of floated him last year. But I've already said I expect the Cowboys to score fewer touchdowns this year, especially through the air.
That is money. I have been drafting Brandon Cooks pretty heavily. I want to go back to the backfields though before we continue here. We're pretty in lockstep with the Cincinnati backfield. I'm of the opinion that they kind of, as you were alluding to, that they value the pass protection chops of Zach Moss. I mean, you look at Chase Brown played very sparingly on 3rd downs last season in his rookie year. Like, yes, there is that explosive factor. To me, that kind of sets him up to be almost the prototypical like change of pace when he's on the field. We expect him to have a higher like touch per snap rate. But to me, they can't really put him on the field and give him the volume that I think drafters are hoping for when they're taking him. One of the things that I've started to toy around with in best ball, and I think you can do it rather profitably, is taking both of these backs where there's so much uncertainty, and doing so in a way where you're kind of banking for somewhat of a ping pong effect. So like weeks where Zach Moss is kind of the guy where they're in catch up mode, where they kind of, or where they on the other side of the spectrum where they need to kind of ease games in the second half and kind of take control of a game environment. Zach Moss might be the guy. And then there could be games where you see Chase Brown get more schemed usage. He pops in like a long touchdown, sees 4 or 5 catches, and he could be the guy that you need on that week. What are your thoughts on kind of in a best ball setting, taking both of these backs on where there's so much uncertainty right now?
Yeah, and I don't know, like, so like I'm someone that like keeps best ball for myself. Like I'm like a more of a casual player. I draft a ton of teams and have it, but I like to have something that's like a little bit sacred where I'm not super into the weeds and like trying to say like I'm trying to do all these optimal things. So I don't know if like someone's done the research on taking 2 guys on the two guys in the same backup. For me, you're talking about a situation like this, it inherently makes sense, right? Because you never have to get it right. Like you would never do this in a season-long league. Because this is a situation where I would call like you get a handcuff, right? Like this is a situation where you draft Kyron Williams and you get Blake Corum, like, as a pure handoff. Like this is a nebulous situation that also could be like you laid out, nebulous on a weekly basis in terms of who's scoring points. And you would never get that right trying to set a weekly lineup. So like for me, like that inherently makes sense. Like I look at like the Eckler, Brian Robinson situation, like kind of in a similar light. Yeah. Like if you were, kind of get those guys, like that's a situation too. Like I feel like you in a season-long league, I just don't want to have that burden of trying to figure out like, am I going to get the game script right? Am I going to get like the guy that's getting the touches inside the 5 this week, the schemed usage, right? But in a best ball league, I'm like, I can put both these guys in. I can just take the best of both worlds. I never have to worry about getting it right. Like to me, that's like stuff that inherently makes sense, but I'm sure someone will push back and say like I've done the data and you cut your odds off of winning this by 2%. I don't know.
Yeah, it is probably like a micro fraction of a percentage. So anyway, I want to stick in the backfields, and there's one player I think who is extremely polarizing coming off an ACL tear, rookie, and that's Jonathan Brooks. What do you make of that situation? Now he'll be playing for a head coach who we know made Rachaad White, who he was last season, widely regarded as the quarterback whisperer. I also throw in like a secondary. He might just be like a running back whisperer as well. And that's of course Dave Canales. What do you make of Jonathan Brooks and how are you handling his situation coming off the injury, being a rookie, and playing for an offense that is projected to be bottom 5 here?
Yeah, I've been making, micro bets on the Panthers anyways, right? Like, we've seen a lot of rookie quarterbacks kind of come in and flame out like Bryce Young, and big picture, they don't bounce back. But we've seen a high number of these guys kind of bounce back in year 2 and kind of have these like course correct seasons. Like, bad guys that like Bryce Young is keeping company with Blake Bortles, right? Like Blake Bortles came back and threw 35 passing touchdowns in year 2. Jared Goff, right? Jared Goff was a disaster that first year with Jeff Fisher, gets the coaching change, comes back and, throws, I think he threw 27 touchdowns his second season. Derek Carr was another guy that like was a disastrous rookie, came back through 30 passing touchdowns his second season. So I've been trying to make like little micro bets on the Panthers with these changes, especially when you think about like top down, what they've done. And this is a team that obviously they know, like they would love to have CJ Stroud right now for sure, but they can't. That's not the world we live in. So what they had available to them this offseason, I think they did a pretty solid job. Like, I don't know if I would have used that draft equity on Xavier Legette, but like, this is the team that went out and like, you can say they overpaid for 2 guards, but they had to go out and get these guys. This is a team that played 10 offensive guards last year. Like the interior of this offensive line was an absolute travesty. Like they went out and identified like this was a major problem with our team. And you look at like top down, their offensive line looks pretty solid on paper, objectively. They need Iquanu to make a step up in year 3, but they've already got a good right tackle in Taylor Moton. Then you get Robert Hunt and Damian Lewis inside. Like this is a team that now looks like it's like, oh, it took a thing that was a clear weakness and like at least objectively looks solid to potentially okay to good. In a range of outcomes now. You add Deontay Johnson, a guy who's a clear separator that can get open. You add a guy like Jatavian Sanders. We'll see what happens with him. And then you add Jonathan Brooks, his backfield that was just inconsistent last year. I also think that Miles Sanders could play just better this year than he did 2 years ago.
No, that's not possible.
I don't think it's going to get it. He's going to maybe get an opportunity. But like, you think about Miles Sanders, what happened to him last year? People forget he was hurt in the preseason. Like he was hurt in the offseason. And we've done like all this research on guys. Think of everyone that was hurt in the preseason that we're giving hall passes to. Travis Kelce, Cooper Kupp, like all these guys that were hurt in the preseason. Like Miles Sanders was hurt entering the year and was probably hurt the entire season, right? And it probably impacted his performance. I don't know if he'll get an opportunity this year, but I know Miles Sanders is a better football player than what we saw last season. So if he ends up getting released, he's a guy that I think it presents some interesting opportunity, especially depending where he goes. But as we get to Jonathan Brooks, I had Stephania Bell on my podcast, not humble brag.
Let's go.
She did talk about that, there was a study that if there is going to be a risk on a reoccurrence rate for ACL injuries, it happens within 22 months of the first ACL. So like that does give him a little bit of risk in terms of re-injury. But I do think for like what you talked about, there's an opportunity here where mid-season and beyond, the ramp up period from the situation just could be better than we think it was. Like we always get into the weeds on these teams that were just so bad, and the taste in our mouth is so bad for the Carolina Panthers from last year. But they're like them to have regression, positive regression, or people hate that phrase, or just regression to the mean, is very low. Like, so, and they play in a division we know that can be taken advantage of. Like, they're not going to run like this uber hard schedule. So I've been taking like micro bets on the Panthers in general. Jonathan Brooks was, I thought, the best running back in this draft class. It just was the stuff that came around with him that kept him down, right? Or that gave him red flags. Like, when will he be back? When will he be back? Be 100%? Those types of things. But this is the best player. And for him to be the RB1 that was drafted in terms of draft capital in this draft, I think is kind of another feather in his cap. So I don't know. Like I said, I've been drafting Panthers though, which again, maybe everyone just tuned out right now, but they're just too cheap, man. It's just too cheap to invest in some of these guys.
There's 2 other offenses that I would consider in the same bucket where I was not like blown away by the off seasons that they had, but they were at least telling us via their moves that they're trying to put their quarterback in the best position to succeed, right? Probably the Titans, and I would put the Giants in that category as well. We can argue with the personnel decisions that were made, but they were at least trying to give Daniel Jones something where they have completely neglected this man up to this point in his career. Are you viewing those 2 teams, the Titans and the Giants, kind of in that same vein where buying into a depressed price offense that is trying to get better?
Yeah, I've talked about the Titans a lot. Like, people that followed me throughout the offseason, like, I've been talking about the Titans a lot. Just the wholesale changes that, not just from going from the coaching staff, over to, Brian Callahan and Nick Holtz. It's also the absence of Derrick Henry, right? And what Derrick Henry kind of forces a play caller to do, because he's just a unique player in his own right. I mean, this is a team that asked Will Levis to win in the capacity that Will Levis was just, it was going to accentuate all of the things that were wrong with Will Levis as a prospect.
Yeah.
You look at last year, he threw the ball 20 yards or further downfield almost at a 10% higher rate than the next closest quarterback.
Yes.
This is a team that ran only 2 wide receiver sets because they wanted to play against loaded boxes and have teams win over the top, right? And that just like Will Levis was one of the most inaccurate quarterbacks on deep throws coming out of college. It wasn't his profile. There was no quick game in this offense for a passer. That's going to change. You're going to a lot more. They're going to be 11 personnel based. They're going to have a lot more. If you look at like what Brian Callahan did with not just Joe Burrow, but Jake Browning too, when he took off, like this is a team that totally reduced the depth of target, wanted to get the ball out of their quarterback's hands. We'll see too. The offensive line, the right side is still a major question for the Tennessee Titans, but they're young from center to left side, but it's a chance this could come together and be one of the better units when you talk about if J.C. Latham gets up. You never want to just start rookie left tackles and say like this is going to be okay. But, Skronsky, Latham, you add Lloyd Cushenberry at center now. Their center situation was one of the worst in the league last year too. There's a chance, like if you squint to see it, like this could come together, be an okay. I'll say J.C. Latham's going to be better than Andre Dillard as a rookie. I think I feel pretty confidently about that. And then you add, Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears in this like interchange. We've already seen Nick Holtz talk about this. This is an interchangeable backfield, and I've been waiting for a team to do this. Right? Usually, when teams get these compartmentalized backfields, it's like what we see what Detroit do. Like where you have David Montgomery in a role and Jahmyr Gibbs in a role, and you kind of use these guys. I've been just waiting for it's like, what if we just run our offense and just kind of swap dudes in and out that are kind of the same? That's going to be really cool. I want to talk to you about something real fast to stem off of this.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote an article this week about like league trends and kind of like how defenses, like we talked about a lot during the season, like we're in this like current like 2-year defensive meta, or like where defenses have had the upper hand in offenses because I think offenses have been playing into the hands of defenses. Maybe it's the influx of athletic quarterbacks or the transition of what college quarterbacks have been asked to do, and that's what NFL teams are doing. But one thing I've noticed that like in terms of success, like the offenses that are still like destroying even this current defensive meta all stem from this Shanahan, McVay coaching tree, and it's because they play under center. We've seen like the rise in shotgun has gone up and up and up every year. Last year, it was at another all-time high. And what that's done is kind of reduce offensive diversity, and it's reduced things like play action. But like these two coaching trees, and McVay is a little bit of difference than Shanahan because they're more 11 personnel based, but they run out of 11 personnel. Like that coaching tree has always run out of 11 personnel, where Shanahan is like that. They want to show you run, make you play loaded boxes and throw over the middle of the field, right? And I just keep looking at these two coaching trees, and Ben Johnson's not from that coaching tree, but he's doing a lot of things that they're doing. And I've been trying to focus a lot more on, and I'm not saying I'm this rigid where I only draft players from like all of these teams, but I've been trying to focus on these teams that do have an attack that is more under center, like based, that's set up to kind of like what combat to like all this too high stuff, all this zone coverage. I want teams with offensive fluidity. And we now have 11 teams that either have a head coach or offensive coordinator from those two coaching trees, the Shanahan McVay coaching tree. And you see, like, I think the league is kind of cognizant of this too. That's why they're getting hired. Because you not only are they having the most success, but you've got Brian Callahan, you said, but I've been trying to focus more on these teams that, like I said, have more offensive duality, so to speak. And I don't know, like, if you have thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, we've been targeting these guys. I mean, we were targeting them heavily last season. We enter Bobby Slowick, Brian Callahan, like the list goes on of like all the head coaches and offensive coordinators now that hail from the extended Gary Kubiak tree, we can say, right? And it's interesting to me because it's hard to point to one thing that is really the determining factor of like what they're doing different, because it's so diverse. I mean, you look at the run blocking scheme, and I got kind of shit on last season because I said man zone concepts, and I was like, let's think about this as far as like run blocking concepts go. You look at like a Mike McDaniel, you look at Bobby Slowick, even you look at Kyle Shanahan's like run blocking schemes. They are not like a gap. They are not a man. They are not a zone. They encompass all of those things. they're using principles from different schemes and from being able to pair those together. I mean, I broke down a play where it was like Bobby Slowick at the Texans, like there were gap concepts, there were man concepts, there were zone blocking concepts, and they do things that all come together to give defensive coordinators fits. Now look at the passing game. I broke down a play where it was Mike McDaniel in Miami, where Tyreek Hill is like in motion and they snap the football after he passes the center. And this was actually a play from gun. We have Tua who is in gun and Tyreek Hill in motion. And instead of like running this defined route that we know what it is, he like continues outside Jalen Waddle, who's playing as the Z wide receiver, and loops around 15 yards
Yeah.
down the field and catches the football with the like defense is like, is that your man? Is that my man? Like, what is going on here? Like, what the heck is a swoop? A swoop route? Like, what is that? So that comes down to me to like these guys are taking the knowledge that they have of the game and they are pushing the envelope forward with like keeping defenses off balance. And that's to me what it is all about. And there's one, I would say, coach in that extended tree that is kind of not doing those things. And I want him to do those more. And that's Zach Taylor in
Right.
Cincinnati. We're just like, I'm like, come on, man, like give me something, like do something new. It's not like his way of doing something new is like moving Jamar Chase around the formation. It's like, okay, yeah, we get it. Like he's your best playmaker, but you should move him around the formation. But like, do something more with that. So that's kind of my read on the situation. I brought up sharp football analysis as you were talking there. Again, follow Rich. Go check out sharp football analysis. You'll see if as you scroll down this, like it's Warren Sharp and Rich Hribar. Todd makes an appearance here. Todd. But like Rich is doing some amazing work over there at Sharp Football Analysis. So go check that out. Hopefully did that answer your question or spark that conversation a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, no, yeah, it's been something that's been, on my mind. And, definitely, like I said, I've been looking at like all these league trends. And like I said, I would never be so
Yeah.
rigid to say like only draft players from these 12 teams, right?
I
Like,
mean, you could.
but like,
Quite honestly, you could.
But I think that there's a little micro edges to be had of saying like, because one of the things we always do this in the off season is we glom onto like all these like player takes, right? Like you get like just 6 months worth of like, this guy's overvalued, this year's undervalued, or like people want to get their name out and say like I was ahead on this guy. And these are like all things that like ultimately don't really matter or are going to help you be like a good fantasy football player. Like granted, yes, you do when you're on the clock, you do pick a player. So you actually have to have you are selecting a player no matter what. So you have to have a stance on that player, or at least thoughts on that player. But, I had teams last year that had Puka Nacua that didn't succeed, right? I had teams with Tony Pollard that were good. But, there's so much more that goes into it besides just like getting a player right. And I think that, one of the things we always overlook this time of year is just like not focusing like, hey, why don't we just take guys that play in like good environments? We do this all the time. Our buddy Davis Maddock, I was the thing with him, and we were talking about Jalen Polk and Antonio Gibson, potentially guys. Like, what if we just didn't take the guys on the Patriots? Like, what if we just did it? Like, what if we just did it? Like, what if that'd be cool? Like, what if that's just a plan? Like, this is a team that's probably not going to be that good. And we don't have to try to thread that needle of like trying to find the guy that's going to be successful in like the diamond, the rose that grew out of concrete, so to speak.
That's very interesting that you bring that up because I had a discussion probably 6 weeks ago, maybe 4 to 6 weeks ago, about why I was okay being overweight Will Levis and not Drake May or Daniel Jones. And the overall, what it boiled down to me is I expect the Tennessee Titans to outperform as a team, as an offense.
Right.
I don't expect the Giants maybe the Giants are kind of on the border still for me. But particularly the Patriots to outperform their expectations. And we as human beings, we're very, very bad at predicting the future. Like, surprise, we're really, really bad at predicting the future. But we can make educated guesses on offenses, which is much easier to do. You look year over year accuracy ratings about projecting like points scored. It's not perfect. Like there are going to be outliers, but it is much easier to do when compared to projecting individual players. And that range of outcomes is much wider than a team's most of the time. So that was kind of my answer. And it took a lot of back and forth to kind of get there. But it's like, yeah, I expect the Titans to outperform as a team. The Giants are probably on the border. And then at the other end of the spectrum is like the Patriots. Like on paper, they've got still a top 5, 6, 7 off or defense. They dealt with a lot of injuries and they're going to have to overcome that. But on paper, like coming into the season, assuming health, they still got at least a top 10 defense. They have a new head coach, new offensive coordinator, like they are new across the board and not in the best ways. I mean, these are all kind of defensive minded guys. They don't have a primary like playmaker. It's like they have Ramondre Stevenson and then a slew of new guys. They have Hunter Henry, like, but what else? How do we expect them to move the football? And what was important to me about that discussion is through my studies, I found that the most correlative function of quarterback scoring is total touchdowns. So, like, yes, Drake
who
May
knew scoring a lot of touchdowns?
You're right. Like, yes, Drake May can like add 4 to 6 points a week on the ground, but like that's more floor supporting than ceiling extending.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That was my take. What do you say about that? Like, are there any other places where you're looking for the team to outperform their current expectations?
Like I said, the Titans have been the front runner for me, like kind of the
Yeah.
offseason. And everyone is on the Falcons, right? Like the changes that they've made. I mean, they're actually projected, I think, to be 12th just from Vegas lines, 12th in the NFL in scoring.
Mhm.
And they were bottom league last year. But that's low hanging fruit because everyone's been dunking on Arthur Smith for like 2 years.
And they're priced for that assumption, right? Like they're
Well,
priced up.
definitely everyone
Yeah.
still has like 1 foot in, 1 foot out on Kyle Pitts, but like London and
Yeah.
Bijan are like they've just been locked in like their spots kind of all off season. Mooney gets a little overlooked, I think, in the situation because we haven't really seen him play with an accurate quarterback. I mean, his accurate downfield targets have been a joke. The Giants, I think, are an interesting conversations. They're a team like because I can't get over the Daniel Jones factor, but I do believe in Brian Daboll. I think like the resume that Brian Daboll was building was strong. And especially even the first year with Daniel Jones, like he put Daniel Jones in a nurtured environment, like where he coaxed out the best of Daniel Jones, where he didn't ask him to make a lot of mistakes. And when you look at Daniel Jones's career this far, these are the players that have over 100 targets from Daniel Jones. Darius Slayton, 302. Sterling Shepard, 202, Saquon Barkley, 189, Evan Ingram, 182, Golden Tate, 118. Like we just have not seen him play with anybody that like could potentially be an elite NFL wide receiver. And they're finally doing that in year 6 of his career. Unfortunately, like with his feet to the flame, where like Daniel Jones has to produce, or he's probably not going to play next year with the Giants. This is the team too. They didn't have a lot to work with in terms of offensive line, but I do think that they did improve. I mean, we'll see how much that improvement is. They're going to get Andrew Thomas back, who basically missed the whole year. This is a team that gave up 85 sacks last year, second most in NFL history.
Insane.
They signed John Runyon to play right guard. They get Jermaine Illuminor to he's either going to play guard or right tackle. I don't know if we'll see Evan Neal again. It looks like Evan Neal's going the Trevor Penning route, but we'll see what happens. So this is a team that did make some moves. So like I'm willing to kind of at least see what happens, because Daniel Jones, at least from a fantasy stance, like we've seen it before, right? Like he has been a guy that's flirted with like high QB2 production and like the right environment. It's been mostly opponent based, like when they can pick on someone, because he just hasn't had the passing acumen. Maybe Neighbors opens it up, but I do think Daboll is going to get Neighbors targets. One thing I do believe in.
Yeah.
I think he is going to use Neighbors well enough to where you look at the gap between like Marvin Harrison and Neighbors, you say, all right, maybe that's a little too wide. Maybe not on a site like Underdog where you're not getting like that full PPR, but I think on a site like DraftKings, maybe like where you're able to do the DraftKings, best ball, like Neighbors is a guy I think that definitely could threaten to catch like easily 90 plus passes. Cause I do think I am confident Daboll is going to get him the football. When you look at what when he got the best version of Daniel Jones 2 years ago, it was all bootleg, moving the pocket, making quick. You have 2 reads, Daniel. You have 2 reads right here.
Yeah.
You read high, low, and then you run if you don't like either of them. Like you guys like what it is. And I think that there's going to be a lot of that back in the offense, for the Giants this year, which I think is good for Neighbors' reception totals. So we'll see
Yes.
kind of what shakes out.
I've been toying around with the idea of Wandale's potential here. It makes sense to me that like losing Darren Waller, he was the mismatch over the middle of the field. You know, he's too big and strong for linebackers. He's too big for safeties, for nickel, for dime. Like no matter who they're going to put on that guy, was able to create a mismatch. Can Wandale like be that new like mismatch over the middle of the field just by being able to win within the first 5 yards of the line of scrimmage?
Yeah, I think the question you have is just how much do they prioritize like Neighbors and what he can do in terms of, where he aligns offensively, right?
Yeah.
To potentially hurt a guy like Wandale. Because if Wandale is just a guy who only plays in 11 personnel, then
Hmm.
how much 11 are we running is then the next question, which again, Dayball doesn't come from this tree where we can just say like they're going to run a ton of 11.
Yeah.
Because this is also a team that we talked about had major issues in terms of pass protection last year. And if you're going to play a lot more 11, that's going to, put a lot more emphasis on the strength of your offensive line as well, or getting rid of the football quickly, which we have questions of Daniel Jones being able to, do. But, I
Yeah.
think Dayball is a guy like like I said, go back to 2 years ago and when he was able to kind of coax out the best version of Daniel Jones, he did a lot of those things. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Neighbors is like I haven't really toyed with the other guys like Hyatt and Wandale very often, but losing Waller is a huge deal for Wandale, like you kind of hit it on, because these other two guys, Theo Johnson and Daniel Bellinger. I mean, Daniel Bellinger, even when he had an opportunity, wasn't a target earner. He's an
Yeah.
athletic guy at least. And then Theo Johnson's more, I think, year one going to be more of a red zone weapon guy. Like I think when he's going to be a situational guy
Yeah. Like a
using his
Donald
assets.
Parham.
Yeah, because this is a guy like if you go back to Theo Johnson at Penn State, this is a guy who didn't break a tackle, but man, he's a big body and,
Yeah.
and he could dunk on some dudes.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Yeah. I want us to transition now to the NFC West. Like we kind of know what to expect, what we're going to get from Sean McVay's Rams. We kind of know what we're going to get from Kyle Shanahan's 49ers. But we have it seems like the field and the industry is not really paying much attention to Seattle, and it's actually the Cardinals that are getting the rest of the love in that division. How are you looking at those two teams in particular, as far as how the field is kind of handling? You know, we got Marvin Harrison, we have Trey McBride, who are being drafted in the first 4 rounds, and then for Seattle, it's just like it's DK Metcalf, and then we don't really know what to do behind that. But I mean, there's a lot of change going on offensively in Seattle. What do you make of those two situations? Are you kind of treating them in a similar light, or is one you think being overlooked more than the other?
Well, I think with Seattle, it's just we have a play caller that has no NFL experience, so it's hard for people to kind of, jump in and try to do from the projection game, which could be advantageous for the field, right? Like when you
Yes.
don't know there, you can take advantage of that situation. Obviously DK Metcalf has held kind of his stagnant ADP. But like when you look at what they did last year, the Seahawks, what we're looking for Ryan Grubbs to do is diversely use these wide receivers in a better fashion than what Shane Waldron did last year. I mean, we can't have the same usage for DK Metcalf. 2 years ago, DK Metcalf, when Dave Canales was involved, had the best usage of his career.
Hmm.
Caught 90 balls. He was used on the shallow and intermediate game at the highest rates of his career. It was great. It's like, oh, we're finally seeing full field usage for DK Metcalf. This is really cool. And then next year they draft Jackson Smith and Jigba, and he completely loses that.
Yeah.
He is forced to live as basically a guy that was getting inefficient targets downfield or targets that come with a lower success rate behind an offensive line. Another one that was a travesty, and I don't know if that's going to be any better this year. Then
Yeah.
you look at Jackson Smith and Jigba. 35% of his targets were at or behind the line of scrimmage, the highest rate in the NFL. Like, what can we do with those? There's nothing we can do with those.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking for Ryan Grubbs to use these guys in a more diverse manner. And it's hard to go back to say, like, all right, well, he used Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, and Roma Dunze in this way. Like, man, this is going to be cool. Like, he's going to be able to do a lot of these similar things, like move these guys around. He's got all these assets he can move around. Tyler Lockett can play in the slot. Jackson and Jigma can be in the slot. What if they move DK as a big slot? Like, all these
Yeah. Noah
opportunities. We just
Fant
don't
could be a
know.
slot.
And
Yeah.
in the backfield too, like, right, like which was kind of we saw last year. It was basically Kenneth Walker playing early downs, then Zach Charbonnet playing third downs. That's like that was like the usage role. So you guys, except for like the span where Walker missed those 3 games. Because one, he left in like the first quarter, and then he missed the next 2 weeks. We saw Charbonnet get that full workload. But I'm curious to see if, from a head coaching stance, if Mike McDonald does kind of what like Harbaugh did, right? And like just delegates. Because we look at the great head coaches that aren't necessarily offensive head coaches, and you think Dan Campbell and Jim Harbaugh. These are the best coaches that aren't offensive coaches in the NFL. And what they've done is just delegated that to another person completely. And if Mike McDaniel's going to do that and Ryan Grubbs is kind of that next up-and-coming mind, that's an overall positive, right, for the entire team. And I'm curious to see, because we don't see a lot of head coaches that do that anymore outside of those two guys. And that's why those two guys have success. Ben Johnson's running the offense and Dan Campbell's cool with it. Dan Campbell is running game theory for us, right? Like he's going for these fourth downs and he's doing all stuff. And Harbaugh's been that way for a decade. We've not always loved Harbaugh's offensive coordinators, but he's delegated to them. And I'm curious if McDonald's going to do that.
That's very, very interesting. I like that call. What about the Cardinals before we move on? Do you think that the introduction of Marvin Harrison Jr. is enough to get this offense off the ground? We have not talked highly of Mr. Kyler Murray dating back to last year when we were together. Is this something where you see him taking a step forward?
I mean, his best NFL sample is playing with an NFL alpha wide receiver with DeAndre Hopkins. I do believe in Drew Petzing and as along the lines of what we said with the other guys, right? Like Drew Petzing is definitely from year one as a guy who kind of showed that I think he gets it, right? So that's a positive, especially what they did in the run game, in year one with that offensive line, which also doesn't look a lot better on paper, but the way they worked around that was great. I'm curious to your take. Not just the Marv Harrison stuff. Like, who do you think is the wide receiver 2 for Arizona? How do you think the wide receiver snaps get dispersed behind Marvin Harrison? Does he move around? Do you think Michael Wilson is the locked in like X receiver? Could he be like an X receiver when they can move Marv around? Zay Jones, Greg Dortch. Like, how does that all shake out for you?
Yeah, Michael Wilson is an interesting bet. I mean, he has rather elite for his age body control and positioning. When you look at the top of his route, he is able to take the right angles at the top of the route, but he's not an explosive guy. He's not a guy that is going to be used as like this downfield threat. So to me, like Marvin Harrison is kind of the Z with benefits type wide receiver. I think they will move him around. I think that we're going to see, based on kind of the offseason that they had, I think we're going to see them look to not stress 11 personnel as much. So that is probably, whether that's Zay Jones, whether that's Michael Wilson, I don't know, out of 11 personnel. 11 personnel, it's very clearly, or I guess more clearly delineated. Like, yeah, Michael Wilson should be operating in the middle half of the route tree. He should be that same like X-type wide receiver role. We should see Marvin Harrison. I hope they move him around the formation, and I hope they utilize him in motion. He proved he can do that in college. But there's a lot of uncertainty for me. How does that mesh with Trey McBride? And we saw Trey McBride come on strong at the end of the season last year, but it was like he was asked to do so much on the field. Is he going to be asked to do the same amount? I'm actually below consensus right now on Trey McBride. Just because there's so much uncertainty.
To figure it out. Yeah. I mean, he's a tricky guy. I mean, he basically operated as like their slot receiver last year.
Yeah.
Like so much of his production came out of basically being a big slot. And we've seen, I mean, if Drew Petzing can turn him into Mark Andrews, right? Like the Mark Andrews role, that's probably overall fine. But we also have never seen Mark Andrews play with like an NFL wide receiver 1. And that's like the wild card here, right? Like that's the wild card in the ointment is even when Kyler had DeAndre Hopkins, he wasn't necessarily supporting multiple bodies because Kyler's been a guy like where he struggled. And I wonder your take on this too. We didn't talk about this with Bryce Young, but with the kind of the NFL defensive structure being more like middle of the field open based, we've seen that really stunt a guy like Russell Wilson, who's a smaller quarterback. And it really stunted Russell Wilson because like he never really threw over the middle of the field, and Russ is a big game hunter. He wanted to throw outside the numbers a lot in Seattle. Even when he had Doug Baldwin, like he's a guy who wants to throw vertical. When he throws over the middle field, he wants to throw vertically. He never was a guy that really took like that shallow middle of the area field stuff. And do you see that the defensive changes being kind of a problem for guys like Kyler and Bryce Young because like their size, like is that a potential problem?
I think so. I think you're onto something there. We're seeing a lot more too high. We're seeing a lot more cover three. We're seeing a lot more. I mean, the league is moving away from man to begin with, but they're also quietly moving away from cover two. It's all
Yeah, yeah.
cover three and too high. You see decreasing trends in man, decreasing trends in cover two utilization. So yeah, I think you're onto
It's a lot
something
more
there.
of that Fangio mat. Like they want to play like a lot more quarters, cover six match stuff. Like
Yeah. Yeah, so we look at like the holes of cover three, of quarters, of cover six, of teams with six defensive backs on the field. Like the hole is like in the middle of the field, behind the linebacking core, and in front of the safety unit, right? So like that's more difficult, I think, if a guy that is we say this in jest, but it's kind of true. Who struggles to see over the offensive line? Yeah, that could be an issue. That's very, very interesting. I had not really thought about that correlation between size and where the
it
defenses
only
are
affects
moving.
a couple dudes, but like
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
know, because it used to be a thing. Like when Russ came out, it's like, oh, we should just ignore QB size again, even though the NFL like they keep just drafting dudes that are built like tanks. Like they'll always value that,
yeah,
or at least we'll get a guy drafted. But I mean, I look at because we have Bryce Young. I talked about earlier, like so much of the interior of that offensive line was so bad last year.
yeah,
And for like paired with like a guy like him, and then you pair that with like where the defensive meta is, and it's like, man, that was probably just like a cocktail that was just a nightmare for like him.
yeah. I
Like,
like that shout. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. We've
but
talked a lot about.
it will be interesting to follow that though. I'm curious those guys because Kyler's been a guy his whole career, like middle of the field has been his kryptonite.
Yeah, yeah, and it's probably going to continue to be so. You look at like how they were utilizing Trey McBride last season, and it was like they were trying to get him in those mismatches, but it was like they were not doing much beyond that. It was like, here's the football. All right, now it's over to you. Like in that week where he was like, ugh, I still remember this because it took me out of first place in the spy. When he like had that fourth quarter, that insane fourth quarter where it was like, man, we got nothing, man. We got Trey McBride. Go do your thing. He had like 7 catches and a touchdown in the fourth quarter alone. I was like, oh man, god damn it. But like they were still not doing things to like really give him the space to operate. It was like, we're going to get you the football 6 yards down the field. Go. Like it's over to you after that. And like he broke a tackle, he drug 4 guys into the end zone for his touchdown. It was like, so that to me is like, is that going to change now that they add an actual alpha wide receiver that makes defenses kind of take advantage of that or have to account for that over the top? I don't know, but
It's just things we don't know. Like they
yeah,
said that because Marvin Harrison is a guy. So you look at his capital and pedigree coming to the NFL, like he's going to command targets. Like there's
mhm,
just no way he doesn't, and that has to hurt a guy like McBride at least to some degree because the gap he had over the field of guys when Kyler came back and he had ascended. I mean, he had over that 10-week run. I mean, he had like 600 more yards than the next guy on the
yeah.
team. Like that's just not going to happen. Like that type of disparity, and like there's just not going to be that wide of a chasm to the next guy.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me from a perspective of like, what is Greg Dortch going to do? Greg Dortch is a guy who has considerably
We got to work Greg Dortch
outperformed.
in.
Yeah, we have to, right? Considerably outperformed against man coverage. And is that a function of like, I don't know what that is a function of. I mean, you look at his underlying metrics last season and like him against pretty much across the board man coverage looks, he was legitimately like a top 24 wide receiver on paper. And that is difficult to overlook. But what is that a function of? And that's what I'm struggling to find. Like, I don't have the answer to that. Do you have like anything to say about Greg Dortch and how they're likely to utilize him this season?
Yeah, that's what I talked about just when we were trying to get to like your feelings on the wide receivers. Like, is he a guy that's only going to be able to play if they go to 11? They don't run a
Yeah.
lot of 11, right? The same thing we talked about with Wandale a little bit. That's kind of my concern with him. And then does he even in there? Do they try to work Zay Jones in, or like if they go to 11, then do they want to incentivize moving Marvin Harrison around to try to give him an advantages? Then you already have Trey McBride, who basically is a slot receiver himself.
Yeah.
So it's just very hard to like figure out where Greg Dortch fits into this puzzle. I worry that he's just like, I was kind of hoping the last 2 off seasons he would get a new destination, like he would just find a new home, because it feels like he's a guy that just needs, anytime he's been given opportunity, he's been good and just hasn't had a clear path to opportunity in an offense. And that's just been like his one roadblock. And I feel like we're in a similar situation again this year with the way this Cardinals roster presents itself and what they kind of want to do offensively, that just there's no clear opportunity for him again. He would have been one of these perfect guys, right? In one of these McVay tree schemes, right?
Yeah, with like, space, this man can do some damage.
If he would have been the guy instead of Tyler Boyd, or where he would have been awesome, especially in the context of where it lays out. And I know that this is just wish casting now at this point, but the Minnesota Vikings would have been perfect for him. Like,
yeah,
they don't, Brandon Powell is like set to be their wide receiver 3. TJ Hawkinson might not play half the season. Like, it would have been a perfect opportunity for Greg Dortch to be a Viking.
Yeah. Now Jordan Addison's off the field stuff. Yeah, that would have been lovely. Do we have about 5 minutes left? We've talked a lot about offensive lines, and one of the first big pieces of news to come out of the NFL cycle so far is Ryan Ramczyk being placed on the whatever the hell list, unable to perform list. But for veterans, he's out for the year, right? That to me is very, very startling for the offensive expectations for the New Orleans Saints. This is not a team that has a great offensive line to begin with. He is probably their top performer. Obviously, we know that like his injury situation is non-ideal, but with him being out for the season, like how does that affect Chris Olave? How does that affect Rashid Shaheed? And some Alvin Kamara down the list? Like, this is not good.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, if you just from that coaching tree, that if you were going to bet on a system making an offensive line it's not good on paper better than, or at least perform better than it should be in terms of like counting metrics, you would bet on them, because we saw Kyle Shanahan do this last year. Outside of Trent Williams, that 49ers offensive line was not good, very good last year. And then what Bobby Slowick did with just all the litany of injuries that the Houston Texans went through last year, and the passing production was still just so good because the quarterback play was good too. But I mean, you look at guys that performed in this scheme, I still think Derek Carr can be functional enough in this scheme to be efficient, right? Like, I mean, we don't, like, they're not going to win a Super Bowl with Derek Carr, but if you're asking him that he has to be on the Garoppolo spectrum, I definitely believe Derek Carr can be that. Like, absolutely. So I do think that the passing production is going to be there for guys like Olave and Rashid Shaheed, or if they get A.T. Perry involved. This is another team that's also not going to play very much 11 personnel. Yeah. So who gets those snaps is going to be important. And what you worry about, I think, in the transition, though, is just what it means for a guy like Alvin Kamara. I mean, he's a guy that had really wild splits depending on the scoreboard last year. Like, because he had a ton of targets, but they were basically like, were the Saints in just jailbreak situation or not? When they were in the ebb and flow of the offense, Alvin Kamara didn't catch any passes. He was number 1 in the NFL amongst running backs in target rate when the Saints were trailing, and he went to 16th in target rate among running backs when the Saints were tied or ahead. So pretty wild splits. Is it the team that just wants to play more balanced football, not be in those, try to avoid those jailbreak situations? Because I worry about that, right? Like, because we saw the Houston Texans last year. It took them basically like half a season to kind of find the identity of their run game. And do the Saints go through something similar? And Alvin Kamara has been kind of a depreciating asset in terms of explosive runs himself and like generating big plays. So that's where I would be a little bit more concerned. But I do think from a passing game perspective, based on what Slowick and Shanahan have done, like in recent years, that I would give the benefit of the doubt to what Kubiak's going to install here to kind of make this look better than it, like to put lipstick on the pig.
Yeah, I was talking with Dan Williamson. We did a best ball draft together last night, and I told him that this is the first year since I was in high school that the Saints have a new offensive coordinator.
It's wild,
crazy.
man.
It's
absolutely
crazy.
Wild.
Yeah. Dude, I'll throw this up there.
Delegation, right? Like, Dennis Allen year 1, or year 2, like he didn't delegate. Like you gotta delegate. You gotta find a way.
I echo this sentiment right here at the bottom of the screen. I am so glad to be talking to you again, man. I have some personal stuff that I have to work through before we fully commit to running back the searching for ceiling, but we are doing everything we can to get Rich and I back together for this coming football season. So hopefully look for that searching for ceiling coming out on Fridays in the new football year. But Rich, pleasure as always talking to you, man. We threw the searching for ceiling together legit last minute last season. We had never met or spoke or really done anything together. But I always love talking to you, man. Thank you for giving us your time coming on today. And I cannot wait to hopefully jam it up with you again this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, you see just here in the show, like our minds are typically on similar things, even when we have differing viewpoints from those
Yeah.
perspectives. But that's why I always love we found instant connection.
Yeah, 100%, man. Thank you again, as always. If you are looking to follow Rich, obviously, if you're not, you again climb out from under your rock. But his Twitter X handle is on the screen. Head on over to Sharp Football Analysis. Get in tune with what Rich is doing over there. And until next time, y'all, we'll see you in the draft lobbies. Cannot wait to see you at the top of the leaderboards.
1 week season.